Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of the Fandom Science Podcast. My name is Lou Farah. I'm a sports science PhD student at York University, and my first guest on this show is Dr. Nick Wattie. Nick is a sports scientist at UOIT. He's a skill acquisition expert and athlete development expert. I met Nick when he was in his second year as a professor. He was looking for graduate students, and I don't know what he did to deserve this, but unfortunately for him, I was his first grad student. He had to put up with a lot, and then he put up with a lot more coming on the show too. We talked about talent, nature versus nurture, his father-in-law Bruce, and a lot more. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. If you do, please give it a like and subscribe below, and tune in for more episodes coming soon in both audio and video. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks for having me, Lou.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So,
sorry it took so long to figure out our schedules and stuff.
No, it's all right. So we actually we try to do this on the night of Game 7, right?
Oh yeah,
Leafs versus Bruins.
Yeah, and the Raptors were playing too. I think it was Game 1. No, Game 1 against Cleveland.
I don't think it was. I think it was against Washington, right?
Oh, you might be right. Yeah.
But anyway, it was Game 7, and we decided on that day way before, not knowing it's going to be Game 7. And the day of, we're like,
oh no, we've got to get out of here.
Yeah,
there's no way we can talk about talent and sport and not watch any sport.
Exactly.
So it would have been a disaster. Even though in hindsight, I'm thinking, the fact that we bailed that night, I think we jinxed all the Toronto teams, maybe. Because
it was just a terrible night for everyone.
It's just not going well.
Maybe because we watched.
Yeah, probably because we watched.
Yeah. So I talked a little bit in the pre-recorded intro on how we met, the work we did in my master's and all that. But can you tell us just a little bit about where you went to for grad school, what kind of research you do at UOIT?
Yeah, for sure. So after my undergrad at Queen's, so that's where I met Joe Baker.
Mm-hmm.
And
shout out to Joe
and Sean Horton and so actually it was through Sean's PhD project at the time that they asked if I could help them with their data collection, and just kind of that was during my undergrad, and before then I didn't even think about research or grad studies or anything like that. And
what did you want to do before?
Honestly, no idea.
No idea. Me neither.
Literally, absolutely no idea.
Yeah.
Everyone, you go into phys ed, so it's for me, it was physical and health education, which is basically now kinesiology. And at that point it was basically gym teacher. I was in a pre-med program, but let's be honest, my grades were nowhere near good enough to get into med school. And so I got involved in this research project, Sean Horton's PhD, a pilot study. And so I was just helping collect data and just involved in their research meetings. And I thought it was just so cool, just sitting around and talking about problems and trying to figure out solutions and what can we do? His stuff wasn't even so much about sport. His stuff was on older adults and aging stereotypes. But it was a really cool study. It was about, they were priming them subconsciously with positive and negative primes, and then seeing if it messed up their physical performance and reaction time.
Legal?
It was it was all approved by ethics.
Okay.
But they had to tell them afterwards that by the way, we kind of fibbed to you.
Yeah.
It's like we were messing with you and we wanted to see what how it would happen. And so it was all fine. It was all above board. But
nice.
But anyway, so I met Sean and Joe, and then from there I went and did a master's at York University. And even then, I wasn't super involved in sport. My master's project is actually in epidemiology and risk of overweight and obesity and that type of stuff. But while I was doing my master's, I started working on some other side projects because I've always, I just love sports.
Yeah, exactly.
I've been a gym rat and terrible at all sports I've ever played, but just love pretty much all sports. And Sens fan, I've got to.
We can bleep that out.
You can bleep that out. You just insert whoever. Just crop over my voice with whoever wins the Stanley Cup this year. Just love sports, and so started working on a few talent related projects in sport and sport expertise during my master's, and then that just kind of picked up from there. So when I finished my master's at York in...
You can just bring that up. Just bring that. Yeah, perfect.
Finished my master's at York in, I would say, what year was that? 2007. Mm-hmm. Then I went over to the UK, to Leeds Metropolitan University. And so it's now Leeds Beckett University. They've changed names, but, yeah, I was
with the Leeds United games.
Not Leeds United. Managed to get to a Sheffield derby, so Sheffield Wednesday and Sheffield United. That was incredibly violent.
Did you? Were you a hooligan?
I was not a hooligan. I was like a terrified, respectful Canadian, apologizing to everyone that I saw at every turn. No, it was pretty intense. But yeah, I saw some great sport actually while I was over there. Now that you mention it, saw some football, saw rugby league is really popular up there. So they had the Leeds Rhinos. That was just an amazing time. And Headingley, which is kind of the little, not suburb, but a little kind of sub area of Leeds in the northern part of the city is, they've got a fairly famous cricket ground there. So we'd have all sorts of international, test matches and one day matches there. And it was fantastic. So, it was in the UK for a little over 4 years. Just kind of kept the ball rolling on research on talent ID and development in sport and youth development through sport, and started branching out in a couple different topics. And then after I was done in the UK, I moved back to Toronto, and did a postdoc, with Joe. And then, that's kind of where things really picked up in terms of like talent research and expertise and, writing a few different papers and book chapters and stuff like that. And then ended up, I had some funding for my postdoc, but, ended up more or less calling it quits because I got the job at UOIT. And that's kind of how your project started actually. Cause
one thing led to another.
Yeah. I started a bunch of stuff while I was at York, and then it was, so then I started the job and Oh, I mean, not only can people not really agree on like one single definition of talent, I would argue, some people argue that there's no such thing as talent. So it's, some people think all the way like really far at one end that talent is the only thing, and that it's the thing that's going to decide whether or not you're going to make it and how well you're going to do. And then at the other end, people think, there's no such thing as talent. And that it's, it's basically all the environment and how hard you practice, that type of stuff. And then there's kind of, in some people in the in between. And then the flip side that kind of make it even more complicated. There's some people that think everyone has talent.
Oh no!
And
I could tell him I don't have talent.
Like, no, my parents will be the first. But ask my dad; he'll be the first one to tell you. I'm very untalented athlete.
Exactly.
And so some people believe that everyone has talent, and then other people believe that it's a really rare thing, that only like a really select few, small percentage of the population has talent.
Right.
So even there's controversy, there's disagreement. And then, as you were saying, in terms of defining like what is it? Like, why is it hard to define? That's been one of the challenges. People find it easier to describe kind of like really, really broadly, like what talent characteristics might be. And again, it's kind of important when we're talking about talent, we're talking about innate talent. Right. So something that at least at some level that you're born with. And so, but what is it? Like, what does it look like? What is it? What's talent in one sport versus a different sport?
Like
what is it in soccer versus gymnastics? Right. Like, and so it's very hard to kind of describe. And so,
So the controversy like around it stems from nature versus nurture, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely one of the things that jumps in. So, how much, is it like, is your achievement, your performance, is it the result of nurture? Is it the environment, how much you practice, or is it genetics? And so historically, that argument has largely kind of split them up, that it's either one or it's the other.
It's either or.
Yeah. And so, and arguably that's been one of the things and some people will say, well, that argument's dead. It doesn't exist anymore. It's obsolete. But I would say there's still people that believe pretty strongly on opposite sides. And you can see that, I think there's people in academia who think that they still kind of fall in one camp or the other. But certainly from what I've seen, like online on Twitter and social media, there's practitioners and coaches that are like, it is, how good you are at sprinting is 99.99999% like genetically determined. And right. And so I think, it's easy to say, well, the idea in academia is dead, but I think it's still alive.
But outside academia, still. Yeah. Because we're just gonna start with like the nature side and then work our way into nurture. So where did it start? Did it start from the Human Genome Project? Like that's all about genetics and.
It's interesting. I mean, this is one of my. This is one of the things. And now we're gonna go down a rabbit hole. I think the idea has been around for a really, really long time. I mean, I think you can find remnants of belief in nature and that you're born with certain dispositions all over the place. So certainly, more recently mapping the human genome has revealed all sorts of interesting things, but arguably it's probably revealed how important the environment is to our genetics and to the expression of genes. But then you've got Galton, who coined the term nature nurture, and who did all these studies on heritability and achievement and kind of eminent people. It goes back to that, but I would argue, you see it all over the place. I mean, so, it depends on how you interpret things, but, you might see, nature beliefs and, that you're born with, a disposition or something like that. I mean, you can, theoretically see that in all sorts of literary works and historical works. The concept of original sin in Christianity is a view that you're born with kind of, like an innate flaw and sin. And then, you see it in all sorts of other like important literary works and kind of cultural landmarks. So I think the idea has been around all over the place, potentially, going back to ancient Rome and Greece and there's kind of, there's kind of tidal waves of popularity in these different ideas. So, around Galton's time, it was nature, and that was predominating, and it's the family that you're born into, and all these types of things, and that was all because of genes. And again, this is very influenced by Darwin's theory on evolution. And then a little bit later, the behaviorists come in psychology, and their beliefs. So guys like Watson and B.F. Skinner. Believing that it's all that we're a blank slate, that it's all the environment that decides who you're going to be and what you're going to be. Though Watson's famous for even saying, give me any person and I can turn them into a lawyer, a criminal, anything, right? Like you give me. And so he even said, he made some pretty wild claims about, people should just stop having kids for like, I can't remember what.
Yeah, he had some of 20 the hottest takes.
Yeah. And just no more like, let's just stop having kids so that we can figure it out. And then when we start again,
we can go back.
We can modify the environment and make sure that everyone turns into like who we want to be.
So I have there's this quote here, the one you mentioned, says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll turn them into anything I want, like doctors, lawyers, regardless of their talent, their race or anything."
Yeah.
So, which is fair enough. We can't go back 94 years because that's how old the quote is, and judge people on what we know today.
Yeah.
But how prevalent is this line of thinking today?
Well, I don't know if people are. I mean, he was pretty extreme.
Yeah.
He was pretty out there and really kind of forceful in his views. But there's certainly people that think, and this is, things around deliberate practice in sport, that just, it's how much really hard, effortful and purposeful practice that you do is going to make you an expert in sport. And that's the only thing. There's definitely people that believe that and that believe that view. So, there's certainly anecdotes of soccer coaches, for example, in Australia who are dictating the exact number of hours of practice for all their athletes, so that they hit 18, they're going to be bang on 10,000 hours, right? Yeah. That 10,000 hour or 10-year rule that Gladwell popularized. And there's things like the what was it called? Is it the Dan Project? No. anyways, there's a golfer who was just trying to reach 10,000 hours. And think they would make the PGA Tour, and it didn't.
Yeah, and he so dedicated 10,000 hours of his time. To practice golf. Well, did he have a background in golf?
No, it was more or less from scratch. But he was, I think he was already, if he wasn't in his late 20s, it would have been like maybe early 30s. I can't remember the exact. I think it's called the Dan Project or the Dan Plan or something like that. Should be able to find it online. If you had a setup like Joe Rogan, maybe you'd have some staff.
If I had
a producer that could look things up for us while we were talking.
My producer didn't show up today.
Yeah, if this was PTI, the error section of our talk would just be through the roof. Like people will just be like making fun of all the mistakes that I'm saying.
Good thing this is not live.
Yeah, thank God. There's certainly that view out there, and but again, if you go back, I mean, it's easy to criticize viewpoints given what we know now, and there's some interesting stuff out there that actually suggests that if we optimize the environment, if we make the environment amazing for everyone, and provide them with all these kind of amazing resources, there's money, instruction, like kind of Watson saying, give me anyone, I can turn them into anything. There's some evidence to suggest that that actually increases the influence of genetic variation. So like there's what's an example? So there's some research on heritability. So heritability is just take some kind of outcome, IQ for example, and you look at how much are the differences between different people in a group due to their genetic variation. What percent is explained by genetic variation? That's heritability, and it's a controversial stat in its own right. But if you look at kids from high SES, high like fairly wealthy, highly educated parents, if you look at that kind of subgroup of the population, then the differences in IQ are 70% or higher explained by genetic variation.
Really?
Yeah. And it's, you can look at it kind of linearly, and if you go to the top end of socioeconomic status, then almost everything is like a very high percentage is determined by genetic variation. You flip that around, you look at low socioeconomic status, so less affluent, maybe lower levels of education within families and in parents, and you look at IQ differences and how much is explained by genetic variation, and that drops down to like 10%. So the environment.
So even though we're looking at the same outcome, IQ, with the same predictor variable,
the genes are still sensitive to the environment. So it's not what genes do what, it's what genes do what in what environment. And so genes are sensitive to the environment that we're in, and sometimes the influence of the environment can just totally swamp the potential or the capability that's within like a genetic code. And so that's just kind of one example, but I think it's a neat example because it really shows like how connected the two are, and that you can't really just split them into two separate categories.
But we still see like and I've seen those on Twitter a lot, like those companies that are like, hey, send us a DNA sample or like something, and $200 and we'll tell you whether your kid's gonna make it or not. And people still fall for that. And
and actually, I can't remember what news site it was on, but Tim Caulfield? Have you heard of him?
No,
he's an academic. I can't remember if he's in Alberta or Calgary. Anyways, he's out west, and he does all sorts of stuff on kind of law and history of science. And he had a really interesting interview about some of those genetic tests. He actually thinks that those are pretty dangerous things in that they kind of
collect information.
Well, it's kind of like fuel, like it's kind of like throwing fuel on like a fire in terms of talking about like genetic differences between groups and ethnicities and quote unquote races, right? He thinks that it's kind of taking a step backwards. That's that kind of like trace your lineage type stuff. In terms of the sports stuff, I mean there's loads of position statements out there from academics, like don't waste your money, basically. Right. I mean, you look at something like not simple, but something pretty straightforward, like height, right? Like height is huge for so many sports. Like it's, we will never be seen in the NBA playoffs in a million years. Like it is just
not even the stands.
No. Yeah. It's, we can't afford that. Yeah, I'll never be invited by MLSE now. This is the end of my broadcast career. No, so take something like height, massively important. Mm-hmm. So many different sports, American football, soccer, basketball, obviously rowing.
Yeah,
it's crucial. We can measure it pretty easily. It's pretty straightforward. It's not complicated. Mm-hmm. We can even measure kids and their peak height velocity and see, all right, and anyone who's had kids will know this. You go to your checkup with your kids and their GP, and they'll say, yeah, this is kind of where your kid's on track to be. It's pretty easy to predict, right? Like it's pretty straightforward. But if we're talking about it from like a measurement perspective or from an innate talent perspective, there are hundreds of genes and gene variants that influence height, like hundreds.
Oh,
it's not like one gene that's like, you flick it on and it's like, sweet, NBA, here I come. It's hundreds of genes. Not only are there hundreds of them, but they can interact with each other, right? And so and they can interact in multiplicative ways. So like it's not just like 1 + 1 is 2, right? Like they're multiplying together and adding up. They can add up.
What do you mean it's multiplicative, not additive?
So it's not just a matter of more of the genes is better. It's sometimes the interaction between the genes and which ones are kind of having a role in interacting with each other. And so that's height. Like that's just height. Like,
and that's one simple.
Like, yeah. And I think we probably, for a lot of sports, you'd argue that something like height is super important to performance. Yeah. But is height talent? Like and again, this comes back to your previous question. What is talent and why is there so much controversy about it? Is it just how big you are, how tall you are? I think you could argue it might be necessary, but is it sufficient to just be big? Is that all that there is to talent? It's probably an important part, but is it everything? Probably not everything. No. And so that's just height as one example. So you take, so many of our sports that we have are so complicated, tracking objects, anticipation. Not only that, I mean, it's not like, music where, you're playing like this phenomenally complicated piece. But in sports, you've actually got someone else who's trying to make you perform worse and get in the way of you actually doing what you want to do. So now you're thinking about what they're thinking. It's so massively complicated.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you've got to be extremely fit. You've got to, have refined skills that are, really specific to your sport. So how do you capture all that in a definition of this is one
definition, one statement. Yeah, that's true. So, but in your model, you have 5 components or like 5 pillars to the model of talent, right? So the first one is innate, which means like it's said, like, okay, you do have in your nature something that would make you talented, and that's not out of the question.
Yeah, so that's
it's not all genetics, but it has an innate.
There's an innate component
to it.
Yeah, and so is if by its very definition there should be there has to be some kind of an innate component to it. And I think the important thing there that's really important to stress is that I think it's I don't know necessarily exactly why, but I think maybe it's because of how we talk about talent.
Yeah.
It's like you just say, yeah, they have it. He's talented, right? Yeah. Or she's talented.
Or you can't teach that. You hear that all the time.
And you talk about it in this really kind of singular kind of concept way and I think that's maybe the reason that people say, well, you either have talent or you don't. But just because there's a genetic origin to it, you can have degrees of talent. Right? All the way from you are just chock full of awesome talent to you have none with everything in between.
Spectrum.
It's a spectrum. And so, and I think that's much more useful. And I think that's, much more productive than just thinking about it as an either or. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's nature or nurture. Right. It's both. And if you look at talent, it's not that you have it or you don't have it. There's degrees of talent. Mm-hmm.
Because let's say like in the NBA, for example, obviously the NBA is the elite of the general population, but within that elite of elite, there's also still a big difference in talent. You see that like LeBron James probably has as many practice hours as the average NBA player.
Yeah.
but
potentially.
But I mean, like, you know, given their history where they played college, and he didn't play in college.
No, he didn't play college.
Yeah. But still, if you look at the trajectory of an NBA player, I mean, they're very similar.
Oh yeah, and I mean, and you could look at, you know, is this talent? Maybe not, but I mean, you know, there's you look at what percentage in pro athletes make it to the Hall of Fame or get awards like MVP, right? There's it's obvious there are players that are better than other players. What's the origin of that? That's the question. That's the complicated thing. But yeah, that innate component is an important part. But I think the important thing is that it's not an either or. You know, it's like height. You can look at a normal distribution, right? So there's going to be a really small number of the population that has, like, you know, very short height. There's going to kind of be like a, you know, meaty middle, average height groups around those values, and there's also going to be an extreme tail, right? That's the exceptionally, you know, whether it's height, mass, IQ, whatever it is, right? Like there's going to be people at that tail end.
Yeah. So, and then the next component is multidimensional. So by multidimensional, like, do you mean that physiological and psychological?
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that, well, it's kind of, you know, to go back to the height example, like it's height is important, but is it everything? You know, probably not. And so there's, you know, talent is probably going to be multidimensional. It's not just measuring one thing. Yeah. And seeing if that predicts performance and, you know, expertise later on. And yeah, and I think that's intuitive, but I think there's also some evidence to support that. So, you know, a PhD student at York University, Katie Robinson, did a really cool systematic review of talent ID in sport, and looked at all these different studies, you know, for across a couple decades of what studies were best able to actually predict who's going to be talented, kind of, you know, in a quasi long term. And most studies just relied on physical measures, so, you know, height and, you know, stuff like that. Yeah. And then a relatively smaller group of studies looked at they measured a number of different things. And basically, the more multidimensional, the more you take into account lots of different things, the more better able you're going to be to accurately predict who's going to be a better performer later. Yeah. And I think that's because I think talent needs to be multidimensional, because performance and expertise in sport is multidimensional. Right. And so you might have some athletes that are phenomenally naturally fast, and they utilize that in their game in a really specific way. And you might have other athletes who maybe aren't as physically gifted, but who develop other strategies to succeed. Yeah. Right. Like creativity or toughness or whatever it is, right? Like it's going to be different in every sport. It may be even specific to the position that they play in sport. The point is that there's different ways of being an exceptional performer. And so there should be different combinations of what makes someone talented. Right. It's not just going to be the same recipe for every athlete in every sport. There's different ways of kind of putting that talent puzzle together. I mean, no wonder there's so many draft busts, because it's just so hard to predict how talent is gonna develop over time and how it's gonna manifest itself in each sport. I mean, you look at, you know, someone like, you know, a closed task, 100-meter sprint. Yeah, you're just starting from going to B, and I mean that's oversimplifying it. It's way more complicated than that. But someone like Usain Bolt would, and probably was, overlooked because he didn't fit the mold of what people picture as a 100-meter sprinter, which is, you know, a little bit shorter, you know, barrel-chested, massively muscular, big thigh. And here's this tall, lanky guy, and he's just insanely fast. And I mean, he even wanted to play cricket. Like it was just, he was borderline kind of nudged towards sprinting because of how fast he was. And so I think there's a lesson there. One, I mean, we have to consider talent as being a combination of multiple different things. And then not falling too much into our own head about, you know, this is talent, this is not talent. And, you know, the second that you start doing that, then maybe you lose sight of, you know, you risk maybe cutting someone or or seeing someone who's not talented when they actually have a lot of potential for talent.
And that ties like into the next component, which is talent is dynamic. So that means it manifests itself over a long period of time, right? Yeah. But then we still sometimes look at peewee players, for example, or like little soccer players and say, oh, this kid's going to make it, this kid's not going to make it. Or even there's late bloomers in people in the pro leagues too. Like you see people get drafted and then spend years in the minors, and all of a sudden they become those amazing players.
Oh yeah, and
or go undrafted and then
they go undrafted. I mean, it's so complicated. Mm-hmm. There's the risk is that we have these kind of biases that we think are talent, and it's not for no reason. The bigger you are, like I was saying, in a lot of sports relates to performance. You're a bigger kid in hockey, like you're an 11-year-old and you're huge compared to the other kids. You're going to be stronger. Yeah. You're probably going to be faster, right? And so it's hard to blame coaches for picking those kids. But I think it's really important to be clear. What they're doing is not necessarily, I don't think, talent ID. They're doing performance ID. They're identifying athletes that are going to be the best performer, that are the best performers at that point in time. Mm-hmm. The rub, and this is where the dynamic piece comes in, is how good of a performer you are at one point in time is not necessarily an indication of your talent and how good you're going to be later on. Mm-hmm. That's really, really challenging, especially in sport, because, sports change pretty dramatically. Like the more serious it gets and the more levels that you advance, right? Like, it's, like you could look at something like youth rugby to kind of the elite international level of rugby, and they're almost different games. Like they're literally played at such a higher skill level, faster, more physical. Like it's much more physical. Like it almost becomes a different sport. Mm-hmm. And so you can forgive people for thinking that they're identifying talent at one stage and it doesn't pan out in the long term, because, playing NCAA basketball is going to be wildly different than the NBA. Like, it's true. Literally everyone is going to be better. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, you maybe were in the top 20%, but where does that leave you?
Where does that put you in the NBA?
And, the dynamic component is, genes can be expressed, they can turn on, they can turn off. Things like life stress, trauma can have massive influences on genetic expression. There's all sorts of different things. And, and then you toss in the random things like, or bad luck. You have a fluke injury, or you're genetically predisposed to a certain type of injury, like tearing your Achilles or something like that.
And you can be genetically predisposed to.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and there's been genes isolated for how sensitive you are to getting concussion and how fast you recover from concussions. So how much does that play into it? Like how much does that play into surviving a violent sport like like American football in college and even making it to the elite level? Like we're just scratching the surface of some of these things, but all that type of stuff plays in. And luck too. I mean, you could just have a fluky injury or just not be seen by someone, or
all those things,
all those types of things. Yeah.
So but what's like I think it's important to make the distinction between talent and skill, because I see in sometimes like books like The Talent Code, where like it's a great read, but it has some interesting ideas, but it definitely confuses talent and skill. Whereas it says like the more you practice, the layer of myelin will build up around your axons and you can process information faster. But that's skill acquisition.
It's learning,
it's learning. It's not necessarily talent.
Yeah, and I think that, and this is where some of the controversy comes in. So is talent something else, something that we can measure? Or is the best way to measure it through performance and through skill? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jury's out. I mean, but that's a really controversial thing. And there's some indication, super early days, but and there was a keynote. I'm forgetting his name now, but there's a keynote at SCAPS in St. John's in Newfoundland. Yeah. And he was talking about just the influence of genetic variation on how quickly people learn motor skills, and so that there's likely a genetic influence. Not to say it's one gene, it's a host of things, but that there's a genetic influence. The genetic variation explains at least a decent percent of how quickly people learn. So, and there are equivalents for physical conditioning, right? So Epstein talks about this in the sports gene quite a bit. You know, there are fast responders to training and like aerobic training that they respond really quickly to training. And so they can progress more quickly, where someone else can still get to that same level of fitness and performance in something like middle distance running or long distance running, but it's going to take them longer,
right?
You know, to build up that level of conditioning. And so the analogy, you know, that keynote was saying was that there might be something really similar with learning. There might also be, you know, a genetic influence on just who is able to even engage in the really hard practice it takes. You know, no one's saying practice isn't important. You can't take,
no, exactly.
You know, I can't just go outside right now, you know, take someone off the street and just, you know, put them in game 4 tonight for the Raptors. And, you know, despite all
that might be your only hope tonight.
Oh, and even if I had a measure of talent it might be our only hope. That could be good. Even if I had the most amazing measure of talent, right? Like I could do this test and wow, this person has talent for basketball. I still can't just put them in an NBA game and they're going to be amazing. They're still going to need to train. They're still going to need to be in shape, right? Like to say that, you know, you still need all those things. The question is, you know, can you have someone that's going to be, that's more able to engage in that type of training, either because of their personality, you know, their rage to master or their level of obsession with the sport that they're in.
Has there been any work to suggest like, exactly the degree of how much genetics has to do with your response to practice and how fast you can advance? Because that's pretty hard to measure too. It takes like it has to be like longitudinal over.
It's hard to measure, and especially because it's so hard to control like learning environments, and especially, I mean, you can do it in a laboratory. You have people come in every day, and every day you practice memorizing more numbers in a list, or you practice like a typing task or something like that, and you can control it really, really rigidly. But that's very different than, you know, practicing a complex sports skill, especially in sports that are team sports where you have to practice with other people. Like your performance is going to depend on how well everyone else is doing too. Again, not for LeBron, but but yeah. So it's a really hard thing to do, to actually like control that practice environment and to see who's performing better. There's some thoughts out there that, you know, that there's debate about this, that, you know, that people are just have naturally good movement patterns. But there's an idea out there that, you know, we all have different styles of walking, right? Yeah. Handwriting, like we all have these unique kind of ways. You know, you and I can both walk up and down the street and we're both doing the same thing, but it could look different, like based on our gait and our style and that type of stuff. And so there's the same idea that some kids might be born with a natural movement pattern. Like their way of doing a movement is so perfectly suited to a slap shot or to skating. Like, and is that a genetic expression? It's just how it's how their like motor coordination has self-organized itself. Is that like innate talent? Like, are those the kids who are really young that are just flying all over the ice or up and down the court or field, and they just move more maturely and in a way that it just aligns really well with that particular sport? It's kind of a big question mark, but it's kind of a neat idea. But
yeah. I mean, so we kind of like can get into gene doping here from talking about genes and talent, because a lot of people argue like we should allow gene doping in the Olympics because there's already advantages and disadvantages genetically between people.
Yeah, I mean, there's variation is going to happen. Like a sport is never going to be a completely even playing field.
Never, yeah.
And actually, I mean, I don't particularly think it should be. I mean,
exactly, but isn't that the beauty of it?
It's supposed to see who's going to be the best.
Yeah.
If ever, you know, it's and some of our best stories are about some of the athletes that maybe haven't been the most gifted, but who have, you know, kind of David versus Goliath type thing. Like they've managed to kind of have an exceptional performance on the day. You know, all those types of stories. Like it's that. aspect, you know, if we control all aspects of sport and make everyone completely equal, it'll be boring. Like what are we looking at? Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I'm not a particular fan of doping and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, not PEDs. I mean, I can see the argument behind PEDs, and actually, I don't really see the argument behind making gene doping legal either, because like you still have to have some kind of integrity, I guess.
Well, I mean, I mean, you know, it's interesting. My housemate when I was doing my PhD, Paul Miller, who is a sociologist and yeah, philosopher and bon vivant. He is, you know, but he talked a lot about doping and in sport, and you know, one of the things that he would always say is, listen, one of the arguments against it is, you know, it's in the rules. It's, you know, you can say, oh, I was trying to, you know, recover from injury and all this type of stuff. But the only thing is, like, everyone knows the rules going into the game. True. And that's kind of the only argument against it, or that, you know, one of the things that we would talk about. In terms of gene doping, the only thing there, and I mean, and it's similar to kind of doping in sport, like regular PEDs, like, you know, steroids and all that type of stuff. You know, because of like the nature of gene expression, and it's not just that, you know, like I said, that you have a gene for one thing. Like how a gene functions might also depend on how another gene in its neighborhood is functioning, and another gene, and another gene, and another gene, and then what environment are you in? So it's this huge cascade. And so you start messing with things, right? And you start, okay, well, we've got this gene for this, and let's do this, and let's modify this person's genetic makeup or their gene expression, and they'll be a better athlete. What are the side effects? Like, what are the knock-on effects? You know, you can do kind of wide scaling gene mapping type studies where you're trying to find, you know, specific genes, but, you know, there's like, arguably mapping the human genome has actually taught us more about how much we don't know about the human genome. Sure. And that there's so many things that we don't know about how things interact. So again, just like you can't give a genetic test to some parent's kid to tell them that they're going to make it to the NHL, you know, what are the risks of manipulating gene expression in elite level athletes? Like what's that going to do? Right. What's the extent of the benefit? I mean, what we've seen from sport so far is that people will probably do almost anything for an advantage, extra right? 1%. But you know, there's probably some danger there, and there's a lot that we don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's like if we don't understand genetics entirely, and I don't think we ever will, considering how complex. You know, I mean, but not in this, not for a few decades at least.
Well, we'll see. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens with technology. Like if you know, not that I'm a computer scientist or anything, but if things like quantum computers come along and their computing power is just like infinitely higher than anything we've ever imagined, what kind of capability is that going to give us? Right. You know, to look at the human body and what we're capable of.
No,
you know, like that's, you know, who knows? Like, who knows where we're going to be? I mean,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, the only reason I said, like, I don't know if we ever will is because you look at other fields, like, for example, psychology or nutrition or microbiology or anything. I mean, they're still advancing. They've been around way longer than genes, and will continue to advance because there's always more to know. But yeah, that's a good point about gene doping. It's like, if you don't know the consequences of, especially, you know, the negative consequences of gene doping, then
I mean, what can happen? I mean, you know, can you you know, influence gene expression and increase your risk of cancer, or maybe influencing one gene because of its interactive effect, like decreases your performance in another area, right? Like who knows? Like there's a lot of unknowns there, and you know, sport and training is complicated enough as it is. You know, the risk is that people are going to reach for whatever they can, but
well, but yeah,
it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, the reality is that whatever is, you know, the performance enhancing fashion of the day is way ahead of what most people think, and is way ahead of the people testing it.
Right.
So who knows what's happening? You know, the Tour de France starts in a couple. You know, who knows what those athletes are doing?
Yeah.
Who knows what people are willing to do, especially in the popular, big money sports where there's a lot of money and a lot of resources for the athletes.
It's true. You see it in MMA all the time, because in the UFC, there's UFC hired USADA to test the athletes, and they show up at your house any time of the day, whenever they want, as many times as they want.
Yeah.
And I'd be willing to bet there's a lot getting away with cheating. Well, there's definitely a lot of fighters getting away with cheating, because there's always going to be ways around it.
Well, and even if you have people showing up and testing you, like, did you see Icarus, that documentary? Yeah. I mean, the science of tapering and masking the effects of some substances, like the science. There's people out there, they're not just figuring that out by accident. Like, there's people who are, I don't want to know if it's their career, but I mean, they're devoting their time and their efforts to figuring out how to cheat and how to not get caught. You throw on top of that, I forget the specifics, but there was, I remember there was an article a while ago reading that there's some subpopulations, I believe. I think it was China. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on, but anyways, there's some subpopulation who, because of their genetic makeup, their body masks the presence of things like anabolic steroids or some performance enhancing drugs. So you could test them you could have the best test till the cows come home, but their body is literally has like a mutation or a unique genetic makeup that masks the effect, like the presence of the substances in your body. And so what do you do? What do you do now? Do you ban those? Do you test everyone and ban those people from sport?
No,
you can't do that. But yeah, it's those types of things. They're one that I think they're really important discussions. And there's some of the reasons why I think, we keep going more and, sports sciences, kinesiology is always advancing in science, but, disciplines like philosophy of sport, sociology of sport. Yeah. Like, we arguably need more of these people to help contribute to these debates, because it's only going to get more complicated. I've even heard some people say, at its peak of doping in the Tour de France, that it was actually like the most even playing field that's ever existed.
Because if everybody doped.
Because everyone was able to dope to a certain level. And as long as you were below whatever, say the score was 80, then you were fine. And so everyone on this one measure of aerobic capacity was at the same level. Now, is that fair? Is that what we want sport to be? That's a different discussion. But, to some people, it is the way of making sport more fair. But then what's because if doping becomes the even playing field, then there's going to be something else that's going to make it uneven again, and who knows what that's going to be, right? Yeah.
So the last component of your model was that talent is symbiotic, which means like interacts with the environment, and we've talked about that. But you mentioned you give an example of bobsleigh in Germany, and how bobsleigh is huge in Germany, and you see a lot of Olympians or a lot of champions come out of there. But it doesn't mean that Germans are just talented at it, because if they were these same bobsleigh athletes, if they were born somewhere else, let's say in England or in the US, they'd be playing rugby, for example, or football, because it's power based.
Yeah.
So, but would it be fair to say that Brazilians are talented in soccer? Because bobsleigh is like somewhat of a relatively unpopular sport compared to...
Oh, man. Making enemies in the bobsleigh world, eh? I mean, don't go to Calgary, man.
If we're going to talk about like soccer, for example, or basketball or something like that, you're not going to have the participation rates that you do have in those sports. But you still see soccer in Brazil, for example, never missed the World Cup, have the highest number of World Cup won.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple different things there. I think the first thing is that, and this is something that me and Joe have talked about before, is that, and others also actually, but is that like nature is nothing like if not a pretty like picky and frugal thing, right? And so, is talent are you specifically talented at soccer, or do you have these subsets of skills and abilities and characteristics that predisposes you to being talented at soccer or a sport similar to soccer? So whatever environment you grow up in, as long as that activity is there, if you have those building blocks, so to speak, that you're going to be talented, in that sport. Right. Versus you could equally be, Epstein talks about this, that, the people, with a particular genetic makeup are track and field athletes in Jamaica, and they've got a predisposition towards an anaerobic muscle system that increases the percentage of fast twitch muscle fiber, that type of stuff. And he says, like these same people do live in the United States, but they're playing football. They're playing American football. They're not all going into track and field. And so there's cultural popularity might dictate, what sport you end up being talented at. And so there's that kind of aspect of the environment that to some extent it's, what's the culture, what's the environment, what's important in that environment. And then where does talent kind of fit on top of that? And again, it comes back to what is talent? Is it your characteristics, base capabilities, how fast you learn, how hard you're willing to work, right? Like all those types of things. The other aspect that I think is important about that symbiotic piece is that what we consider talented at one point in time might not always be what we consider talented at another point in time. So I'll give a shout out to Jörg Schorer, who mentions this literally every single time we talk about sport. Every single time we talk about sport, he talks about Dirk Nowitzki.
He loves Dirk Nowitzki.
Does Jörg ever love Dirk Nowitzki? Like life-size posters on his walls. Like, yeah.
Definitely has Dirk Nowitzki car seats in his, those like we have custom ones like Ronaldo and Michael Jordan, LeBron, like car seats.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he definitely has one of those.
100%. I mean, yeah. Probably all his passwords are like Dirk something or like, but you look at someone like Dirk Nowitzki, here's a 7-footer, right? And when he was kind of coming up and developing as a basketball player, at that time in the NBA and arguably in the NCAA also, but definitely in the NBA, like that was, in the late 80s, early 90s, you've got real big men in the NBA, like Shaquille O'Neal, you've got Hakeem Olajuwon, and these are post players who lived down low and had a real short game and played a physical game. A lot of these big guys, big 7-footers. Yep. And along comes Dirk Nowitzki, and one of his coaches encourages him to learn how to shoot 3-pointers and to play a much more diverse game. And so that's an example of literally changing what talent looks like for a 7-footer. Like I would argue it expands the range of what talent can be for a player of that size. Right. Now it's swung all the way over there. I would argue, we probably don't really have any true centers in the game anymore. Like not like Shaq and Patrick Ewing.
It's a dying breed if there are any.
Well, I mean, there are big guys, but
but not in that specific role.
Yeah. And they're, being encouraged or maybe even people are looking for big men who can shoot better. Who knows, right? Like it's probably a combination of both, of instruction and skill. But what talent looks like for a 7-footer in the NBA now is very different than it was in the early 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, right? It's completely different. You look at something like whether you're right or left-handed in tennis. And being left-handed could be a massive advantage in tennis, especially when most of the people are right-handed, because the right-handers...
You haven't seen as many left-handed. You haven't faced them, so
they're more rare, right? Yeah. But they also hit the ball to different places in the court, right? If you're hitting mostly forehands, the ball's going to go to different places. And so if you're right-handed and you're used to hitting to someone's backhand, you're now hitting to a lefty's forehand, and you're about to eat the ball. And so people start looking for left-handed players. That's now talented. Okay, right. That's part of being talented in tennis. And then all of a sudden, there's all these lefties. There's more lefties around, and it's not that big of an advantage anymore. And so now what's going to happen? Well, probably more righties, right? And so even what talent is very symbiotic with the environment, with culture, with just trends, fads in sport. What's popular, what's not popular, what we think an athlete should be or should look like in a specific sport, or what a characteristic or a skill set should look like. And so talent can be changing. And that's another really hard thing. And so if you're like a if you're like a competitive coach or something, and you're picking athletes right now, there's a chance that your idea of what's talented is not even going to be what's talented, what we consider talent to be in like 10, 15 years when that athlete is eligible to be an elite level athlete. So again, brutally hard. So what do you do?
Yeah.
Right? Like how do you keep our sports systems flexible enough to accommodate talent that the definition might change? Like you said, like it might be something that we don't see early on and that shows up later. I was reading an article a while ago that I thought was really cool about Chris Draper and how, he was someone that no one thought was that talented. Like he's, journeyman in kind of, semi-pro leagues and American Hockey League. I think it was American Hockey League. And someone just happened to see him play a game and he won something crazy, like over 20 face-offs in that game or something. And he said, like, do you think you could do that in the NHL? And of course he's going to say yes. Like, and there's someone that, no one, in all fairness, like he had a great career in the NHL, but before that, would anyone have said, oh yeah, this guy, I'm going to bet on this guy long-term?
Yeah, you see that in like, for example, Andrew Shaw, he was passed up in the draft, I think twice. Like he was at least once, but probably twice. He entered the draft once, got passed up on, and second time, and the third time Chicago took him. And now everyone's looking for an Andrew Shaw, who was like, maybe not now because he's kind of been a shithead lately, but like early on, everybody's looking for an Andrew Shaw, where it's like this small feisty kid who can like score goals and also get in your face, and that's why it's so hard to predict, because if it was so easy, everybody would win all the time.
Yeah. Oh yeah. If it was easy to predict, yeah. I mean, everyone, some of these sports, you're talking about soccer in Brazil.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of money being spent. Yeah. Kids are, some of these kids are developing in the favelas and, in the ghettos and stuff. But, in whether it's the FA in England or the Bundesliga, whatever, like they're spending millions and millions of dollars every year.
Yeah.
Good chance they might have figured this out if it was that easy to just figure out this is how we identify talent. But yeah. And
one more thing, like about the being left-handed in tennis. So it's also been shown in MMA where they call like the fighting hypothesis.
Yeah.
Where like being left-handed is such a minority in the general population, but the reason it hasn't been evolutionarily like eliminated, I guess, or like the reason we still have left-handers today is because when men fight each other, being left-handed gives you an advantage. And so that's why this trait has continued to live on and hasn't been eradicated. And so in MMA, when you compete at lower levels of MMA below the UFC, like in the regional circuits and all that, left-handers have an advantage, and it's been shown to give them quite a big advantage. But then when they step into the UFC, where everybody is talented or everybody is skilled and everyone has faced multiple people in their lives, and our experience, you don't see that advantage anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's kind of like that, what I was saying earlier about when you go up a level, it's like the sport has changed. It's like all of a sudden what was an advantage is not an advantage anymore. You can't, just because you were the biggest kid, when you were 13, all of a sudden now at the next level, everyone's big.
Yeah. So,
and so what's going to set you apart now? If you were just, you're a lefty and you're just pummeling guys because you have this significant advantage, and all of a sudden you get to a point where what you've relied on, what's been your talent, is maybe it's still
not going to take you.
Maybe it still gives you. Maybe it's still a part of your talent, but how does that change? How do you adapt?
So my next question about that is, you can lose skill, right? Skill can be lost, just like it can be acquired.
Yeah. I mean, learning is bidirectional and linear, right? So I mean, just like development, you can
go one way or another.
You can go one way or another. Yeah.
But can you lose talent?
Well, that's an interesting question. So if our, that what Joe and me and Jörg have written in this model paper that, knock on wood, it'll come out. I don't want to knock on your cheap equipment here, but I'm afraid it'll break it.
No, very expensive.
Very expensive high-end stuff. But if that dynamic aspect is is accurate, if that's a legitimate aspect of talent in sport, then there's the potential that just like talent can emerge later in development, can it go away? I don't know. The really challenging, I can't say it's not possible. The challenging thing is the longer you go on in development, the more experience you accumulate, right? The more practice, the more knowledge and expertise about your specific activity you develop, right? And so how do you separate that nurture component from the natural side? And that would be really tricky. Like, how do you, because there are obviously athletes, speed, strength, things like that will always be relevant. Will decrease as you get older in sport. And and that might, the influence on your performance might depend on how important some of those types of things are. But while you're doing that, so look at Jaromir Jagr. I mean, what has he been in the league for like 55 years now? I don't even know.
Probably
like
it's
unbelievable. Yeah. Is he as fast as he was? Is he as strong as he was when he was in his 20s? Absolutely. There's no way. Probably. I don't know for sure, but probably
definitely not as fast.
Definitely not as fast. He's been lucky enough to avoid catastrophic injury. Yeah. He clearly still has the motivation to stay in the game. So where's that coming from?
Definitely takes care of himself in terms of nutrition.
He must have to. But his experience and knowledge of the game, like how many plays he's seen, people moving, patterns of play, it must be unbelievably impressive. Like his knowledge of the game, whether he can express it or not, is one thing, but his experience and his knowledge of the game from a purely experiential point of playing the game must be through the roof.
His brain must be ahead of his body.
Well,
like a step ahead of his body, because you got to slow down as you age. And so like you're processing the game so quickly and you know what's going to happen. You read the next play, but your body can't get you there.
And so the challenging part there is, so he has all this experience that he's built up over this incredibly long career at the highest level of hockey, right? And how do you separate that experience from the innate talent part?
Right.
And so let's say hypothetically your innate talent can go away. I don't know.
So somewhere or another.
I don't know what that would look like. I don't know, but then how do you then control for the fact that they've been a student of the game and played in so many games and practiced for so long and seen so many players and been involved in the game for that long? How do you get rid of that? And so that's like one of the really, I would say, the really challenging things to your ideas. Like, how would you know what's what? And that kind of comes back to the challenge of what is talent. How do you know what it is?
So philosophical.
How does it, well, I'm a smart guy. You give me a drink. So
my
mind is running now. But that's the challenge. Like, what is it? And what's the balance? And the tricky thing is that balance might be different for two different players. Right?
That's definitely fair.
And you look at athletes, good athletes will adapt as their career goes on. Like Michael Jordan, arguably in his second 3 championships, was a different player than in his first 3 championships or before he even won championships. And so he adapted his game. He changed his game. Is there something there like obsessive and part of his personality that allowed him to do that? And that personality is like an innate part of his talent. Who knows? Or was he the type of person that can learn things very quickly? And so his rate of learning, I don't know, right? But all I know is
it's posters behind it.
It's crazy amazing.
Yeah. But like there is one thing that you hear that these type of people have in common. By these type of people, I mean like Jordan.
Whoa, what do you mean these type of people?
Like like him and then everyone below him. But like Jordan, like the people who are like the best of the best in every field. Like they sometimes have, and I read this paper about it one time. They were like they display some psychopathic tendencies and personality. I mean, they're not psychopaths, but like they have some of those traits.
It's funny. I was literally talking about this with my father-in-law this weekend. So he's just a sports nut. Like he just loves all sports. And granted, most of his sports that he's obsessed with happened before the Second World War, but he loves the sports. He loves talking about sports. This is one of the things that we were talking about. And he
was at the first NHL game ever.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think he was a ball boy at Wimbledon the first year it was opened or something. This is amazing. I was like, can we have another podcast where I just make fun of Bruce for like an hour and a half? I'd love that. Is he gonna listen? Well, he doesn't know how to access podcasts, so it's no.
I'll make him subscribe.
Yeah. No, but so it's interesting. You bring it up, and just recently this big study, this Great British Medalist Project came out, and one of the things that they were doing was trying to understand who British Olympic medal winners, who are these people? How did they get to win an Olympic medal? Mm-hmm. What environments did they grow up in? What kind of training did they do? What was their life experience? And one of the things that they did was fill out these questionnaires, kind of personality type inventories. And some of the things that some of these medalists scored high on were ratings, that are characteristic of psychopaths, and to a certain degree sociopaths. But
was it like being very low in agreeableness, for example, like compassion?
So very willing to disregard other people's feelings, emotions and wishes. Yeah. Like you're very focused on yourself and your own success, to a certain extent willing to sacrifice social relationships, and very willing to sacrifice other people in order to get to where you have to go. And so that's quite an interesting idea. It really a lot of times we see these athletes and we see them as these amazing athletes, and we think, wow, they must be great people. I want to hang out with them.
Yeah.
Because we project these things. They're so good at one thing. They must be cool people. And this is, again, it's kind of early days in that type of stuff, but there's some indications in business that business executives share similar, sometimes characteristics, or inventors, things like that. And so it's a really interesting idea. The reason I was talking about it with my father-in-law is that he's reading this. I mean, it's unbelievable. The book is it's got to be like 4 or 5 inches. It's the biggest book I've ever seen. It's this biography on Ted Williams. Mm-hmm. He's arguably one of the best baseball players of all time, and the last guy to hit over 400 in Major League Baseball. And so here's this guy who is, without a doubt, a Hall of Famer, like one of the best batters in the history of the game. And he's telling me that one of the things that he's learned reading this biography is also turned out to be like literally one of the truly most terrible human beings of all time. Oh, wow. He was incredibly abusive to his family, to his wives, children, things like that. He was incredibly mean and cruel to the press, all these different types of things. Like really like a nasty piece of work by all accounts. But is that part of it? I don't know. Like there's that kind of nastiness part, and there's kind of the selfishness part. And so, I mean, again, this probably all exists on a spectrum, kind of type thing.
Because you don't have to be selfish to excel in sports, because most of the time it's all about you. And
you've got to be obsessed about you and what you're doing, right? And so there's a great interview. Simon Whitfield, who is a Canadian triathlete, and he won the first gold medal at the Olympics for triathlon the year it was introduced. He was giving a talk at this triathlon event. It was before the Toronto Triathlon a few years ago. So he's giving a kind of talk to doing an interview in front of all the people who were signed up to do it the next day. And so he was talking about what it takes to make it as an elite level triathlete in sport. And so one of the questions he got was, do you think you could make it now? Like, do you think you've got what it takes to beat, if you could rewind the clock, could you beat the kids that are doing it now? He's like, no. And so he starts talking about the Brownlee brothers, who are two brothers who live in Northern England, who are arguably at the Olympic distance, probably, the best male triathletes in the world. Like they're just, they've just dominated Olympic distance triathlon in the last couple of years. And the thing that he said about them, he said that he'd gone and visited them over the holidays to kind of, talk with them and stuff. And he said, literally everything they do is about triathlon. All they think about all the time,
their life just revolves around
it. They're obsessed. And he talked about an American female triathlete, same thing. And he said, is this healthy? And when Whitfield said, no, probably not. but is it what it takes to make it in elite sport now? Probably. And so there's an important point there. Like, how important is that personality component to achieving and to being talented in something that's so competitive, where such a small like sliver of people get to make it to the top level, let alone be the best at that level, right? Like, that's a whole other ballgame. And so it's really interesting. So yeah, I think that's a whole really interesting area for research, is looking more into those types of things. And, you know, how does that figure into, if talent is multidimensional, like how important is that dimension to being talented at something?
So like you hit on a really important topic where all you have to think about is triathlons, you know, or like hockey or football, or whatever it is that you're trying to make it at. But then how do you fit sampling sports in that equation? Because, you know, there's sampling, there's specialization. And then, you know, if you sample more, you know, you develop more like physical literacy over time, and also helps you build more social skills. And whereas if you specialize, you know, you could increase your chances of burnout and injuries.
I mean, I think there's a couple compelling arguments for sampling. On the one hand, it depends what you think the purpose of sport is. So very, very few people end up becoming high performance athletes and experts in sport. Like, it's a very small percentage. And so and I think it's a fair argument. What should be the purpose of sport in society? Is it to make better kids and to have them influence positive development and that they're healthy, thriving, good, you know, members of society? Or is it to develop elite level performers? If it's both, how do we do that? And which side should we err on? I don't know. I mean, I think that's a fair question to ask. And so I think that's one thing, you know, maybe in favor of the sampling side. The other thing that I think is pretty important is, you know, the kind of motivational aspect. Even if you're obsessed about something, like I think there has to be some component there that's tied to motivation and whether it's loving a sport and being obsessed with it, and how much those overlap. Maybe that's only possible to find out what you really love in sport if you try a number of different ones, versus you're just put into one thing from an early age and you're told this is what you're going to do. Maybe that early intrinsic motivation, enjoyment, maybe that's a really important kind of seed that ends up sustaining people through when it gets tougher and when it's maybe less enjoyable. And I don't know, like there's that type of argument. You know, there's other arguments, like, if, you know, being more well-rounded in terms of your motor skills. Is there a transfer? Can there be transfer between sports, or, you know, sports that have similar patterns of play, or, you know, invasion sports? Can you learn from the different things and apply them? You know, that's it's an argument. The transfer will be limited a little bit. There research has shown there can be some transfer in similar tasks, but, you know, domain specific expertise is still what's going to trump things at the end of the day. Injuries, all those types of things. The reality is, for some sports, is it possible in some sports based on the peak age of performance? You know, female gymnastics is probably not possible. Tennis, you could argue, maybe also. The other thing that I think is really challenging, that I think, and I actually think people are starting to get into this right now, and I think it's a really cool area for research and for thinking about sampling versus specializing in sport, is again, just like nature nurture. We probably can't just think of sampling and not sampling, or specializing and sampling, or whatever. There's probably way more gray area that's actually happening.
It's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, there was a colleague that was mentioning a case study that they did on a young female athlete, and if you just looked at the number of sports this athlete was doing at a really young age, they were 100% sampling, right? Like, there's she's playing, I don't know, whatever it was, 4 sports or something like that, right? Okay, sampling, bravo. When you dig a little bit deeper, it's actually, this athlete was so insanely performing at a high level on each of those sports this athlete was actually specializing in four sports.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Right? Like in volume and intensity, and it's not like deliberate play. They're not just having a good, like, this is like the top level of these four sports for this athlete's age. So there's clearly, this is also like a spectrum, right? This is also areas where there can be, and where do our top athletes exist? Are they sampling, or are they really specializing in some of those sports, or all of them? I don't know, right? I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's a really cool thing to start looking at. I know that there's students at York that are looking at this. At Michigan State University, there's some really switched on grad students working with Carl Erickson there, and with Joe and Jess at York University. They're starting to look more at, and in Europe too. There's some really cool people in Europe doing this. They're starting to look a little bit more at the detail. Like, it's not just, how many sports you play and when. Like, there's a lot more rich stuff in, what level are you at? Like, what's it really, how many hours are you really putting in? How much are you really practicing? Like, and I think we're going to find out some really neat things about athlete development when we start to get some of that data and check that out.
Because it's true, because even when sometimes we talk about practice, even practice at a high level. So, for example, there's a study in junior hockey, I think it was junior A, where they found that players were kind of like stationary, or like, not moving or doing anything for about 40% of the practice time, something like that, like between 40 and 60, I can't remember.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, you think it's practice, like, learning, hardcore dedication and
no, it's the classic gym class. You look at a gym class, half the class is standing around, right? And
even at junior A, which is
and I think that's an area where sports science is going to have really profound influences, and it also influences how we measure that nurture component. You had a 1 hour practice, but how much were you really practicing? And how important is that downtime in a practice to actually consolidating learning and reflecting on the drill that you've just done, right? It's not unimportant.
You don't want to be going 100% all the time.
No. And so I think, just bean counting the hours is, that's been, the method for the most part. Hopefully, as technology gets better, as we've got software now where it can code behavior in practice in ways that's been, it's never been easier. Right? Like, you can just code a huge array of practice of behaviors within a practice for athletes. And then
so it could tell you like how much an athlete's putting in, for example. Like,
we've got some software in our lab that's super cool that you can, let's say you videotape a practice. You can create a coding system that codes every skill the athlete's working on. You can code how much time they're active versus inactive. You can code all sorts of things. How much time they're interacting with their coach for feedback. How much time, and not only how much time, but how often. So you can count it, and you can count the amount of total time. We can do all sorts of stuff.
It's never been easier to study.
It's fantastic, right? And so as we get more complicated, like we have the challenge that it becomes more challenging to crunch down that information into like a deliverable like nugget. But what all these tools are going to let us do is understand, what's optimal, or maybe even hopefully one day what's optimal for which athlete, right? What works the best, and maybe even be able to even use that in identifying athletes for talent ID. There's a really cool scientist that I was chatting to at the Skill Acquisition Symposium before NASPA in Montreal a couple of years ago, and he was talking about measuring athletes just in terms of like a fairly simple skill. Like I think it was like a field goal kick, but in like Irish football or rugby. I can't remember exactly the sport, but literally just measuring the percent of time that different athletes worked on skills they were already good at versus the skills that they were less good at. And so there's the subpopulation of athletes that they spent more time practicing the things that they weren't good at.
Is that the right way to do it though?
Yeah, you want to improve. If you want to improve, you want to practice the things the skills that you haven't perfected yet.
Right.
And so is that a measure of talent? Right? Like your awareness of, I think you could argue it's also a skill that you can teach that, but I thought that was a really interesting thing. And the technology makes it a lot easier to capture that type of information, or at least to quantify that information now.
Now, I can't remember what MMA coach I was listening to, but he was saying something like, you want to work, and again, this is where like the differences come in coaching methods and all that. It's like he said, you want to work 80% of the time on the things that you're good at and 20% of the time on things that you're not good at. So that the things that you're good at and what took you to that level that you're at, will stay sharp while you're also getting better.
Yeah,
but I don't know.
I don't know where he's getting those numbers from.
I don't know where
he's getting that ratio from.
Yeah.
I don't know. Mm-hmm. Maybe that ratio is different in different sports. Maybe
it's very arbitrary to say 80-20 too.
Yeah, who knows? But maybe and it depends in a combat sport, especially MMA, because athletes will have different skill sets, right? Yeah. In grappling, versus striking, right? So, do you need to practice things you're not good at? Maybe. Maybe that depends on the opponent you're about to face. Sure. Maybe if you're about to face an opponent and your defensive ground game is really your weak point, but that's their strong point. Maybe so maybe the balance changes depending on the opponent, depending on case by case. That's certainly the approach that I would take to it from a skill acquisition perspective. But who knows? I would argue we don't really know what that ratio should be yet, but maybe that's something that, that we can find out more about, and that, people are doing more and more, and whether it's Ross Pinder and his kind of skill assessment drill, or Damien Ferro at and their group in Australia doing stuff on measuring the complexity of practice and how cognitively challenging it is. And people are developing more and more tools for measuring how hard a practice is, the different skill sets within practice. It's really kind of taking off right now. And so I think, in 5-10 years, to see where that whole idea of measuring skill acquisition is going in practice is going to be really neat. It's going to be really neat. And most of that is about optimizing the learning environment to improve learning and performance. But it'd be kind of neat to think about along the way, is that also going to tell us anything about talent? Right. And to kind of keep that in our minds, is anything in there kind of useful, or can it inform our ideas about innate talent? Who knows? But
and speaking of practice, just one more thing before we end is we talked a lot about blocked versus random practice. I think this would be really cool to mention to the listeners too. Is blocked practice is when you practice a free throw over and over and over again, and you become really good at it. And fast, but then you decline. Whereas,
so with block practice, like you say, it's just something like practicing a free throw over and over again, or a jump shot on a basketball court from the elbow from 15 feet. You shoot 20, 30, 40, 50 shots in a row. Research is pretty clear that you get really good at that skill in practice. So during the practice itself, your performance at that shot would go up and get quite a bit better. But then when you take a chunk of time, you come back, or you go into a game, that your performance dips from where you were at your best. So it's not that block style of practice is not the best for learning, for permanent learning, and for really kind of permanently acquiring a skill. It's more likely to crumble under pressure. So in stressful game time situations, that performance is more likely to suffer. And the flip side of that blocked type of practice is random, or high contextual interference practice, where you practice a variety of different skills. So let's say instead of just shooting 50 shots from 15 feet from the elbow, you take a shot from the elbow, then you practice a pass, and then dribble, then a layup. A whole array of different skills.
In the same drill, you mean?
In the same drill, in the same sequence. You're not repeating the same thing over and over again. You're mixing it up. Really good coaches are already doing this. They're designing really creative drills where you're working on a specific thing, but in a way that is providing lots of different ways to do it. You're not repeating the same thing over and over again. Everyone's active. So what we know about that more random style, it's way harder cognitively. Like it's, you make more mistakes during practice. How fast you learn, it's slower.
Yeah.
But your level of learning at that skill is going to be more permanent. Mm-hmm. So if you come back at a later time, or if you measure someone in game, they're still at that same level that they left off in practice. And it seems to be more, it seems to hold up better under pressure and in stressful game time situations. So less prone to choking and stuff like that. But yeah, it is really hard. Like it's a much more challenging, much more challenging type of practice environment for the athletes, because you're not, succeeding as much. You're failing more, you're struggling. But because you're mixing up skills more,
it's more relevant for game situations.
Well, it matches. One idea is that it matches games a lot more closely. The other idea is that it forces you to plan and execute each skill. You can't just like lock and load a shot program in your mind and do it over and over again. That random style forces you to plan and execute different movements and different skills constantly
on the go.
And so there's an idea that that's better for learning, that it's more cognitively complex, and that complexity is better for long-term learning and performance.
It's the choking under pressure that's so interesting about it too. It's like, okay, I get why it's random practice is more relevant for in-game situations, because you're not going to be standing at your sweet spot 50 times a game scoring points. But this choking under pressure, that's what's interesting. It's like, why does that happen?
Well, I mean, it's maybe related to the fact that you're used to performing the skill in kind of more complicated ways, and that it's that you refined your own feedback mechanisms more, so that you've got a more rich experience to inform, like executing like a shot or something like that. There's all sorts of interesting ideas out there about it, that it's that because you've been more like mentally involved and like awake or conscious, about like you're more engaged. That's the good word. You're more mentally engaged with everything that you're doing, and you have to be. You can't just put it on cruise control and just shoot a bunch of shots, right? You have to learn more from each unique experience. That's just better overall.
Live in the moment.
Yeah. And if you can toss in that kind of environment, make it stressful and replicate game situations, all the better. And so, that's what a lot of people are trying to focus on right now. It's pretty cool. Really definitely cool. If you're going to the driving range this spring don't just hit your driver, like 40 times.
What I do is I run, I take a good run up, like Happy Gilmore, and then
Oh, that's good. Yeah. I have to practice walking because usually I have to walk about like 8,000 yards on one par 3 just because of how bad I am.
When you golf?
Oh, of course.
Really?
Yeah, you got to be active. Yeah.
I mean, you do have to be active.
Well, come on.
Well, this was amazing, Nick. Honestly, I can't thank you enough.
Oh, no, this was super fun. Anytime. Yeah, I really enjoyed this.